Were I to attempt to give a detailed day-to-day account of everything that happened to us, and of the sensations we experienced during those 2 weeks we spent at Hood of Rees, this record would probably begin to assume the proportions of the Golden Bough. I shall have to limit myself, therefore, to narrating only those incidents I consider to be of outstanding significance and interest. This does not mean, however, that I shall fail in my duty as a chronicler and omit mention of vital details. For instance, I may say at once that after the discovery of that mark on Mrs. Nevinson's ankle, nothing more of an unusual or alarming nature took place on the night I mentioned before. We went to bed soon after, and slept as well as might have been expected under the circumstances, and it was not until the following morning that Mrs. Nevinson complained of having had a strange nightmare. A nightmare, she declared, that was different. We'll come to that next in this story of My Bones and My Flute. Mrs. Nevinson told us of her nightmare. I was in a small creole, and I was paddling it either up or down river, but I think it was up river. And then for some reason I decided to land. So I steered the boat toward the left-hand bank. I'm sure it was the left-hand bank. And I got out at a place where there was a kind of opening in the bush. When I went ashore, I found myself on a narrow track, and then something told me I wasn't alone. I got the most shivery feeling. I sort of knew for certain that I'd been brought to this spot for a definite purpose. I began to look around, and then I saw some creature, a greyish furry thing with claws. It scurried past me, and I felt terribly frightened. I wanted to scream out. I began to run along the track into the jungle, not knowing where I was going, and as I ran I heard a grunting, scratching sound behind me, and I was certain something horrible was following me. Then what do you think? I heard a flute playing ahead of me, and I had a terribly strong inclination to follow the music. I just felt I had to find out who was playing that flute. I ran on along the path, and then the most horrible thing of all happened. I felt a bony hand grip my arm from behind, and a voice whispered in my ear. I can remember the words distinctly. "No farther today." I felt I was going to faint. And then I woke up. None of us attempted to interpret this dream, though it seemed to disturb Jessie a great deal. When I was alone with her for a moment on the northern veranda during the morning, she asked me in her naive manner if I thought there might be any meaning in the dream, and somehow on this occasion I could not bring myself to play the pompous savant. The expression on her face fanned alive in me one of those strong impulses I had been having of late to hold her and pet her. It was so strong in this particular instance that I had to ask myself whether it could be that I was falling in love. I squeezed her arm and told her that personally I thought the dream nothing to bother about. After her experiences in the dining room last night, is it any surprise that she had a nightmare? The mark on her mother's ankle had faded considerably overnight. When we examined it at breakfast, it was a mere bluish-pinkish smudge, and by noon it had vanished entirely. Naturally, its disappearance caused us to wonder greatly, but we did not discuss the matter at length. We had already reached the stage where wonders had begun to be accepted as mere features of the day's routine. Lunch passed without incident, and after we had risen from the table, we went out on the northern veranda to laze until tea time. We were four very tense people who tried to cover up our tenseness in desultory bursts of carefree conversation. Outside, the day seemed so peaceful and greenly ingenuous. The river, like a black magic mirror, reflected the bush on the opposite bank with such a faithful clarity that it almost appeared to have a quiet, smiling intelligence of its own, which induced it to reproduce objects in its vicinity on pain of suffering some secret punishment if it failed. The sawmill chugged away in unvaried monotony. Now and then there would be a clatter of boards or the clank of chains as logs were hauled up from the bank to be cut. Now and then the strident cackle of human laughter or a shout of merriment exploded on the hot air. It was shortly after 3 o'clock that the new manifestation occurred. I had finished writing up my diary and was doing some work at my easel when Jessie sprang up from her desk chair and her father stiffened in the Morris chair in which he was sitting. The book he had been making a pretense of reading dropped to the floor with a fluttering clop. I got up at once, putting down my brush and palette on the stool. I heard it coming from the river. Jessie was hugging herself. She stood with her back to the veranda rail, leaning hard against a rail and biting her lower lip, staring before her, her face very pale. In the hammock, Mrs. Nevinson sat up and looked around. "What's wrong? Is it happening again?" I flashed her a glance. "What do you mean? Can't you hear it?" She cocked her head and wrinkled her brows. "No, I can't. I really can't say I hear anything like a flute." "Distantly, listen again, listen." She tilted her head again, but again she said, "No, not even distantly. The sawmill is the only sound I can hear." I could give her no more attention, for I noticed that her husband was preparing to rise. His hands were gripped tightly over the arms of the chair, and there was perspiration on his forehead. He kept his gaze on the door that opened into the dining room, that trance-like look about him. It was a repetition of the evening before. He tried to get out of the house, but I succeeded in stopping him. Both he and Jessie seemed exhausted after the ordeal. They sank down into chairs, breathing hard and with strained expressions. Contrary to what her father had expected, Jessie did not see the apparition. But Mr. Nevinson told us, "It's clear now. It shifted from the corner of my eye and has come almost directly into my line of vision." After a silence, Mrs. Nevinson asked, "What is it like? Can't you describe it?" He seemed reluctant to say anything. Then after a moment shook his head and murmured, "There's nothing human in this, Nell. The figure I saw was misshapen, more beast than man. It was upright and bore a slight resemblance to a human. But it had no features I could make out. It seemed to keep its head, if it can be called a head, slightly averted." He shuddered and added, "And its limbs were cloaked in a strange grey fur, though at one instant I was inclined to think it might have been soiled rags instead of fur. It was definitely nothing of this earth. Of that I haven't the faintest doubt." Listening to him, I could not help reflecting how utterly absurd his words would have sounded under different circumstances. What pitying skepticism would have stirred in me? Had I not had the events of the past few days as evidence that we were actually participants in a series of uncanny happenings, I should have wanted to laugh at him outright and tell him he had been reading too many of the ghost stories of M.R. James. The apparition he described could so easily have been one of the demon creatures of the late Professor James, misshapen, more beast than man, cloaked in a strange grey fur. Even his way of describing it had a touch of James about it. Why cloaked? Why not covered with? It was not until later that afternoon, when having a quiet chat with him, that I discovered that his mode of expressing himself had indeed been subconsciously influenced by M.R. James. The book he had been reading at the moment when the manifestation occurred was Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. He had brought up with him, he admitted, several volumes, fictional and otherwise, that treated of supernatural matters. "In view of what had been happening before I got aboard the steamer," he said, "don't you think it natural that I should be intensely interested in every phase of the subject?" He smiled at me, though not without some discomfiture. Jessie said that the flute had sounded this time right beside her, almost at her shoulder. "The next time we hear it, I'm sure I'm going to see this demon thing Daddy is seeing. Heavens! But can't we do something to stop it?"
Something like what? Her father asked her.
"Burn the manuscript, or at least try to burn it. It might drive away this old Dutchman and stop him from bothering us. I can't stand this much longer. I feel as if I'm going off my head. Something terrible will happen to me if I see this thing you've seen. I don't want to see it."
She began to sob, and her mother and I had to do what we could to calm her. She was trembling uncontrollably. Despite her excitement over Mr. Nevenson's description of the apparition and this outburst of Jessie's, I had by no means forgotten the new development which had attracted my notice when the manifestation began. As soon as Jessie had been calmed, I tackled Mrs. Nevenson, doing my best not to sound like a police inspector, though I fear that this is exactly what I must have sounded like. But that's another part of the story. My bones and my flute.